So when we think about the Declaration, obviously the idea of Jefferson creating this Declaration on his own is the mythology around it. I think this is important because obviously when we think about the truths, the self-evident truths, we look at the idea of individual rights. And so it really boils down to, when we think about the idea of America, it boils down to a person or person in nature, the idea of man or humanity in a state of nature, and that we have these rights. It's not groups of people, it's individual people. And this is interesting because if you think about the Declaration itself, it wasn't written only by Thomas Jefferson. He just wrote the draft. But in fact, it was actually edited by John Adams from Massachusetts, Ben Franklin, who you all know, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston. So this group of 5 people, at the time, everybody knew the Declaration wasn't written by Jefferson. It was just that first draft. And Jefferson, in fact, hated the Declaration because if you go back and look at the draft, it was completely torn up by the other guys, added all kinds of ideas and thoughts that weren't his to begin with. And Jefferson felt it wasn't really his declaration anymore when they were done with it, which is interesting because, of course, when we get to the Jefferson Memorial, we celebrate one person. We celebrate Jefferson. We celebrate that triumphant individualism. And it's interesting to look at the timing of the Jefferson Memorial right in the middle of World War II. And this idea of we were fighting for democracy and individualism in the middle of this fascist authoritarian threat from Hitler, from the Japanese militarists, and from Stalin, even though we were allied with them at the time. But the point is that we were really a nation defined by individualism, individual rights, and I think that's a key piece to add to it. Another thing that Jefferson talked about was this idea that the way that the founders viewed themselves was as an aristocracy of merit, meaning they rose to their position as leaders of this new nation because they were gifted by nature with incredible intellects and unbelievable political acumen and all these sort of qualities that these guys had. And this kind of deification of the founders begins with their own mythology, which is that they were exceptional people. Now, that may actually have been true. They were exceptional people. However, they weren't just everyday people. They were people that were born to wealthy families, and they were given a lot of education. And so I think it's fair to say they were certainly smart guys that had incredible talents, but they weren't people that wasn't entirely self-generated in the way that they thought it was. And so Jefferson's kind of living this mythology of the self-made man. He's not a self-made man. He's a man who inherited a lot of his money and who spoke about this idea of meritocracy. So meritocracy, this idea that we all earn our place in society, is very deep in American ideology. And of course, if you look at it, well, it's interesting that the people who tend to these days, who are at the top of that meritocracy, are also people that come from very wealthy families. So as David Brooks says a couple of years ago, it's a new narrative is emerging. It is that a new meritocratic aristocracy has come to look like every other aristocracy. In other words, this idea that the founders were rejecting, which was, okay, I'm great just because my parents were great. They were trying to come up with a new way, if that was the new narrative. And what Brooks is saying is, no, we're just right back to where we always were, which is that rich people get richer and they're the ones that get the success, and poor people have to work much, much harder to get there. And so this whole idea of meritocracy is a little bit hard to argue for when you really look at the circumstances. So that's another part of the American ideal, at least something we think we are, at least in principle, but we really aren't when we look at the reality. The last part, of course, everybody says, the United States is a nation of immigrants, and we think about the Statue of Liberty, which was given to us by the French in 1886 as a way to commemorate their alliance with us against the British in the American Revolution. But at that point, this idea was that the Americans and the French, two Enlightenment nations, stood together with this idea of freedom, and that all these people could come. So if you look at this poem that was written by Emma Lazarus, which is on the Statue of Liberty, which you probably all know or have heard of, Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Right? So there she is lifting her lamp, not just of liberty, but that last line is important, right? The golden door, a door to economic opportunity, not just rights. But again, just like the pilgrims that we saw at the beginning, they were coming to make something of themselves economically. So the symbol of obviously this enshrinement of the ideas of Jefferson in the statue, but it really was about welcoming immigrants, which of course in the 1880s was true. We had a very open immigration policy, which was at that time, again, that ideology worked at that time. But remember that shortly afterwards, in 1924, we have immigration restriction. And most of our history is defined by opposition to immigrants, whether it was trying to get all those southeastern, more dark-skinned immigrants out in the 1920s, or whether it was caging Mexican families in the last few years under Trump. We've always had a strong rejection of immigrants by the people, usually who feel threatened by them, even as the idea of our country is welcoming. So there's this tension between the idea of freedom and the idea of acceptance of immigrants and the actual reality. So let's put all of this together. What is the American Creed then? It's the idea as a constitution, as an agreement between the people in the country and guaranteed by God. In other words, there's a religious element to our Constitution, just as there's a religious element to our whole country. Our democracy is sacred, which is one reason why the attack on the Capitol was seen by many as a desecration of our sacred house. And it was basically one of the reasons why so many other countries were alarmed at what happened, was because there is this idea that America represents this kind of model democracy. And we can laugh about that now, but we've always viewed ourselves as that. So in some ways, to give up that democracy, you could say that, Donald Trump and more authoritarian leaders are challenging that idea of who we are. Even as he challenges the democracy, he also challenges the whole idea that we're exceptional, basically saying, we've got our own problems, right? We're no better than anyone else. We just have to, make America great. We've got to focus on our issues. So equal rights in a very unequal world, right? In despite of our inequalities, incredible inequalities that have existed throughout our history, we always emphasize this idea of equality. We are kind of starry-eyed idealists. We live in a harsh world, in an unequal world, but we emphasize this idea that we could be this equal society, and we strive for that. The importance of meritocracy, the belief that those with talent will rise, not just those who have rich parents. Again, this is being challenged by the current state of American society, which we've already talked about a little bit. And finally, the idea that we are a nation of immigrants, both voluntary and involuntary. But even as we're a nation of immigrants, we're a nation that has very mixed feelings about those immigrants every time they come. So this defines what the American Creed is. Hopefully this gives you some idea of the way we view ourselves, and we'll be able to touch on these things as we move forward in the course.